The silver sedan came in fast and wrong, headlights slashing across the asphalt, at the angle of something that had given up steering. Nora Vasquez heard the tires before she saw the car. A long, tearing shriek that cut through the bass rumble of the kitchen exhaust fan and the murmur of the last few customers nursing coffee inside. She was standing at the service window, order pad in hand, and she turned her head toward the sound with the particular alertness of someone who had spent years listening for trouble in parking lots at night. The crunch came a half-second later. Not the catastrophic crunch of a high-speed collision, but the dense, intimate crunch of a bumper finding another vehicle at moderate speed, the kind of impact that leaves no room for the other driver to pretend they hadn't felt it, the kind that changes things. She was outside before the sedan's door opened. The night air carried the sweetness of honeysuckle from the vacant lot next door, undercut by the sharp petroleum smell of fresh tire rubber burned on hot asphalt. The sedan had come to rest at a diagonal across two parking spaces, its front right corner buried in the rear quarter panel of a white Honda Civic. The Civic's trunk had buckled inward. The sedan's headlights were still on, painting the whole scene in flat white. And in that light, Nora saw a young woman standing beside the Honda, hand pressed over her mouth, phone already raised. The woman had been there when Nora came on shift at 9. She had eaten alone at the window table, reading something on her phone, and she had left a 40% tip on a $12 check, which was the kind of thing Nora noticed and remembered, because the people who tip like that on a $12 check are the people the world is quietly grinding down, and they know the value of small kindnesses from the inside. The sedan's driver's door swung open, and a man got out. He was tall and thick in the way of a man who had once been athletic and had since converted that frame to something softer, and he was wearing a dress shirt open at the collar with the kind of casual confidence that said the shirt alone cost more than Nora made in a shift. He put one hand on the roof of the sedan to steady himself, and in that small, steadying gesture, Nora read everything she needed to know. He was not checking for damage. He was finding his balance. The woman by the Civic was named Adela Cruz. She was 28 years old, and she had been on hold with the Fresno Police Department's non-emergency line for 4 minutes, and the hold music was a cheerful, synthesized melody that had nothing to do with anything happening in this parking lot. The man's name was Dex Hollis. He was 41 years old, and he owned enough commercial real estate in the Central Valley to have a Wikipedia page, and he had not been told no in a very long time. You could see this in the way he moved, which was the movement of a man for whom space had always arranged itself conveniently, who had never developed the habit of checking whether what he was about to do would cost him anything. He took 3 steps toward the Honda and looked at the crumpled quarter panel with the expression of a man assessing a minor inconvenience. Then he looked at Adela. Then he looked at Nora, standing 15 feet away in her black server's apron, and his expression did not change. "You work here?" he said. His voice was loud and imprecise, the way voices get when the mechanism that usually calibrates volume to circumstance has been taken offline. "I do," Nora said. "Call me a car and get me some water." Adela had lowered the phone from her ear. The hold music had stopped, which meant someone had picked up, and she spoke in a careful, clear voice, giving the address of the parking lot. She gave it twice and spelled the cross street. Dex Hollis turned to look at her. The look lasted a beat too long. "You're going to want to end that call," he said. Nora crossed the distance between them in 12 steps. She came to stand between Dex Hollis and Adela Cruz, and she stood there with her arms loose at her sides and her feet planted on the asphalt, and she did not say anything at all. The service window of the diner was 8 feet behind her, and through the glass she could see Loretta Pham, the owner, watching with a dish towel twisted in both hands. There was a look on Loretta's face that Nora had not seen before in 6 months of working for her. Not fear. Something more considered than fear. Later, Nora would not be entirely able to explain why she had moved. It was not a calculation. It was not heroism, which is a word that belongs to stories told afterward about decisions that felt, in the moment of making them, less like courage and more like the only available action. She had looked at Adela Cruz standing beside a car with a crushed quarter panel and a phone at her ear and a hand over her mouth, and she had looked at Dex Hollis steadying himself against a sedan door with the deliberate dignity of a man determined not to appear as drunk as he was, and something in the geometry of the two figures had been wrong in a way she recognized from deep in her own experience, and her feet had moved. That was the whole of it. She had simply been someone who could not stand in the service window and watch. The back corner of the parking lot had been the first thing Nora noticed on her initial night of work. 12 motorcycles, all of them Harleys, all of them black and chrome and substantial, arranged with the precision of something deliberate and maintained. And she had asked Loretta about them that first night, still in the process of learning the geography of the place, and Loretta had folded her arms and thought for a moment before answering, the way people do when they're choosing the right words rather than just the accurate ones. They come every Friday, Loretta had said. They eat in the back booths. They pay in cash, and they tip well, and they do not cause trouble. And trouble, over the years, has learned not to follow them inside. The last person, who tried to collect a debt from one of Loretta's regulars in the parking lot, had left in a condition that discouraged repeat visits. Loretta had not elaborated on this, and Nora had not asked. She had accepted it as a feature of the landscape and had served the men their coffee and their pie without ceremony, and they had treated her with the specific courtesy of people who do not need to perform it because it is simply what they are. Those motorcycles were still there. The diner's back door opened. Nora had been working the dinner-to-close shift for 6 months. Before this job, she had worked the breakfast counter at a chain restaurant on the edge of the industrial district, and before that, she had done inventory at a big-box hardware store. And before that, she had done 2 years of community college on a schedule that assumed you had no other demands on your time, which was an assumption that could not survive contact with the actual shape of her life. She had dropped out in November of her second year when her mother's cleaning schedule became Nora's cleaning schedule, and she had not gone back. This was not a wound she carried. It was simply geography. The map of her life had certain features, and she navigated them as practically as she navigated any terrain, knowing where the roads were and knowing where they weren't. What she had was reliability. She had shown up for every shift at Loretta's in 6 months. She had not called in sick, not because she had not been sick, but because she knew the cost of an empty shift to a small place, and she had taken that cost personally, which was its own form of loyalty. Loretta had noticed. She had not said anything about it directly, because Loretta Pham was not a woman who said things she didn't need to say, but she had adjusted Nora's schedule to give her the better shifts and had twice pressed an extra 20 into the cash envelope at the end of the week without explanation. These were Loretta's form of acknowledgement, and Nora had accepted them in the spirit in which they were offered. In that time, she had become fluent in the rhythms of the place. She knew the lull between 7 and 8 when the dinner crowd thinned, the second wave of coffee drinkers around 9, the long quiet of the late shift when the lot emptied out, except for the trucks idling at the far end, and the occasional car pulling in for the pie that Loretta made fresh every morning and sold out of every night. She had learned which regulars needed the coffee refilled without asking, and which ones needed to be left alone, and she had learned that the men in the back booths on Friday nights, however they looked from the outside, ran a table with the particular orderliness of people who understand what disorder costs. She had seen one of them, the young one with the wire-frame glasses, correct a wrong item on his check and returned the difference. She had seen another hold the door for an elderly man on a walker with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. These were small things. She had collected them without knowing why, the way you collect evidence of something you haven't yet named. The back door opened and two men walked out. The first was built like a man designed for a specific purpose, wide through the chest and shoulders, with a shaved head and a scar that traced the outer edge of his left eyebrow like an old signature. His leather cut was black and heavy, the patches catching the sedan's headlights, a winged death's head above three letters that needed no translation in Fresno or anywhere else in California. His name was Knox. He held the rank of sergeant-at-arms. He moved across a parking lot, the way water moves through a channel, without hurry and without deviation. And everything about his movement said he had arrived at precisely the correct time without having needed to hurry to get there. Behind him came the man who was the reason Knox's patience was absolute. Dutch Harmon was 58 years old and built like someone who had simply outlasted everything that had ever tried to stop him. He was barrel-chested and white-bearded, and his full-sleeve tattoo included an eagle with spread wings across the back of his right hand that seemed, when his fist was closed, to be in mid-flight. He wore reading glasses on a thin chain around his neck. His cut carried the same death's head, but with two additional rockers and a president's patch that he wore with the ease of a man who has inhabited a title long enough that it is no longer a title. It is simply what he is. He crossed his arms and stood and said nothing, and the parking lot changed around him the way a room changes when a particular kind of authority enters it. Knox stopped at Nora's left shoulder, one step back, and said nothing. Dex Hollis looked at the two men. The calculation was visible on his face, slow arithmetic performed by a machine running below its optimal capacity. He registered the cuts. He registered the patches. The specific designation on those patches was taking longer to resolve than it should have. "This doesn't involve you," Dex said. Dutch Harmon did not respond. "I said, this doesn't involve you." The second saying was louder, with the flat emphasis of a man who has built his professional life on the premise that repeating a position firmly enough will eventually make it true. Knox turned his head and looked at Nora without expression. It was not a look of inquiry. It was a look of acknowledgement, precise and complete. "You are standing here?" he had noticed. Inside the diner, in the booth second from the back, a young man named Trick had set down the menu he had been holding for the past 40 minutes. He had not ordered from it. The menu had been a prop. Trick was 29, lanky in the manner of someone who moved fast when the occasion required, with wire-rimmed glasses and a Prospects rocker on his cut, the single stripe that meant he was still earning the rest. He was patient about this. He had skills that made the earning a matter of time rather than outcome. He opened a ruggedized laptop with the unhurried calm of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had just identified it. "Your car is still running," Nora said to Dex Hollis. She said it quietly. Dex looked at her with the irritation of a man who has decided he controls the room and keeps finding this decision contradicted. "I know my car is running." "Adela," Nora said without turning her head. I'm here, Adela said. Her voice was steadier than Nora expected, with the steadiness of someone who has decided that shaking is a luxury they cannot afford right now. The dispatcher's still on? Yes, recording. Dex Hollis looked at Adela. He looked at the phone. He recalculated. Then he did what men who have always solved problems with access do when access seems to be failing. He reached for more access. He pulled out his phone, a new model in a slim case, and he held it with the practiced ease of a man who uses it the way other people use words. I'm going to make one call, he said, and this is going to go away. Dutch Harmon spoke for the first time. Put the phone away. The sentence had a particular density. Not loud, not shaped like a threat, shaped like an outcome. Dex Hollis looked at Dutch. His calculation was audible in the silence. You have any idea who I am? I know exactly who you are, Dutch said. This was not, in that moment, fully true. It would be in 8 minutes. Trick's fingers moved without pause across the keyboard. He had started with the sedan's plates, moved to the registered owner, then followed the name through 3 databases and 2 news archives, and a public campaign finance disclosure that the city of Fresno posted on a server that most people had forgotten existed. He was not building drama. He was building a timeline. The timeline was the kind that accumulates around a certain kind of man over decades of near consequences, each incident resolving just slightly better than the record should allow. 2 DUI arrests, the first in 2014 and the second in 2018, had been reduced to reckless driving by an attorney whose client list included 2 sitting city council members. A civil suit filed in 2021 by a pedestrian named Gerald Okafor, who had been struck in a crosswalk in Clovis, settled quietly for a figure whose terms included a non-disclosure agreement. A pattern of campaign contributions to a county supervisor who sat on the board that governed liquor license renewals in Fresno County. Trick compiled it without commentary and saved it with the date in the file name and turned his screen toward the door. Outside, the situation had developed new weight. Dex Hollis had shifted from irritable to strategic in the way of men who have run out of social tools and are reverting to the tools they trust. He had moved forward 2 steps. Knox had matched him with a single sideways step, and Dex had looked at Knox with the new arithmetic of a man who has just registered something he should have registered 10 minutes earlier in the evening. His phone was still in his hand, but he had not raised it. The threat, when it came, was specific. This was the thing about Dex Hollis. His cruelties were not general. He had the precision of a man who had spent years identifying the exact point of leverage in any negotiation. And he had found one here, and he used it with the confidence of a man reaching for a tool that had always worked before. He looked at Nora's apron. He looked at her face. Something resolved in his eyes, a connection made between the face in front of him and an address in a database somewhere in the back offices of his property holdings. I know this building, he said slowly. 4 blocks east. 314. You're in 4B. The blood moved in Nora's ears. She had felt this before, the particular surge that precedes fear. The body's warning system engaging before the mind has finished processing what it has been warned about. She had learned over years that the surge was not fear itself. It was a measurement. It told her exactly how much she was holding. She was holding. I own that building, Dex Hollis said, and I can have your lease reviewed and terminated within 30 days for cause, because there is always cause if someone looks hard enough, and I employ people who look very hard. You want to keep standing there, you go right ahead. See how that plays out for your lease. The parking lot was quiet for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Then Loretta Pham came through the service door. She was 5'2" and 62 years old, and she had run this diner through 3 recessions and 1 fire and 2 floods and a pandemic without flinching. And she had not survived all of that by waiting for someone else to move first. She looked at Nora, then at Dex, then at the buckled Civic, then at Dutch. "Dutch," she said, "Trick's got something for you." Dutch did not look at Loretta. He was already looking at Dex Hollis with the expression of a man who has completed his assessment and is now waiting for the right moment to read the verdict. He reached up and removed his reading glasses from the chain around his neck and settled them on his face, and he looked at Dex Hollis over the top of them with the patience of a man who knows he has all the time that exists. "Come inside," Dutch said. Dex Hollis went inside. The diner at 11:15 p.m. held its breath along 2 registers. At the counter, a couple had gone still over their plates, forks suspended. A man in a trucker's cap near the front window had developed a sudden, absorbing interest in his phone. Near the kitchen, 4 members of the Fresno Charter occupied a booth in the specific silence of men who are present and ready and have decided that readiness is sufficient for the moment. They did not stand. They did not need to. Their stillness was its own language, and it was perfectly fluent. Trick sat at the back booth with the laptop open, and when Dutch directed Dex Hollis to the table, Trick turned the screen to face the room. Knox produced a chair from the neighboring table and set it down with the deliberateness of placing a period at the end of a sentence. Dex sat. The document on the screen was 12 pages, organized by date, each incident headed with a jurisdiction and an outcome. The dates ran from 2014 to tonight. The outcomes formed a pattern as legible as a name written repeatedly in the same hand. At the bottom, below Gerald Okafor's settled case and below the campaign finance records, Trick had added 1 final entry for tonight's incident, documented by the diner's exterior security system and by the personal phone of one Adela Cruz, currently in conversation with the Fresno Police Department. Footage time-stamped at 11:09 p.m. Dutch pulled out the chair across from Dex and sat down and placed his hands flat on the table. "That young woman outside," he said. "Her car will cost $4,200 to repair. Cash. Tonight. You have a wallet." Dex Hollis looked at the screen. He looked at the dates. He was doing arithmetic. The results had changed. His phone had been on the table for 6 minutes, and he had not touched it, which was, for Dex Hollis, a duration with weight. "She'll get paid," he said. "She'll get paid now," Dutch said. "Cash. Tonight. Not through an adjuster. Not next week. Now." The silence that followed had the quality of a room waiting to see if a window would hold. Dex opened his wallet. It was the soft kind, well-worn, the wallet of a man who carries cash, not from necessity, but from preference, who likes the physical sensation of his own resources in his hand. He counted the bills on the table carefully and set them in a stack with the deliberateness of a man who needs to perform each motion correctly because the larger motion of this evening has escaped his control entirely. Trick watched him count, not dramatically, accurately. Knox picked up the bills and walked out without a word. Through the diner window, Nora watched him cross the lot to where Adela stood, still with the phone at her ear, and she watched Knox hold out the folded cash without speaking. Adela looked at him for a long moment. Then she took it. She said something quiet into the phone and lowered it, and looked at the money in her hand with the expression of a woman recalibrating her estimate of what was possible. Dutch was still looking at Dex. "That file is going to the district attorney's office in Fresno County at midnight tonight. Not because you hit a car, Because of 2014 and 2018 and Gerald Okafor, and because the attorney who made those arrests disappear is currently under a separate investigation by the State Attorney General's office, and this document is directly relevant to that inquiry. 2 journalists are receiving it simultaneously. The relevance will be understood before the morning. Dex Hollis had the look of a building losing its structure floor by floor. He was the kind of man who had built his sense of himself on the premise that consequence happened to other people, to people who lacked his resources, or his contacts, or his capacity to identify the path around the obstacle. This premise had been tested and had held across 41 years of choices that would have had other men standing in front of other kinds of authorities. He had come to treat it not as a fortunate condition, but as a natural law. And natural laws, when they break, do not bend first. They simply stop applying. He looked at the 12 pages on the screen, and he looked at Dutch Harmon's hands, flat on the table, and he looked at the room, the booths with their quiet occupants, the door that Knox was not guarding, but that Knox's presence made feel guarded, and he understood with the clarity that sometimes arrives at the worst moment that there was no call to make that would fix this. "The woman who works here lives in a building you own," Dutch continued. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way you describe weather, as a series of facts with causes and effects. "Her lease will not be reviewed. Her rent will be frozen at its current rate for 3 years, confirmed in writing on Hollis property, group letterhead, signed, notarized, in her hands before next Friday. If that letter does not arrive, the file goes to 4 additional journalists and to every member of the county liquor licensing board, which I understand matters to your business operations." Dex Hollis said nothing. The arrogance had left him the way air leaves a punctured thing, not all at once, but completely. What remained was a man considerably smaller than the one who had stepped out of a silver sedan 25 minutes ago. This was the true face under the architecture of money and access, and the long immunity of never having faced a room where none of those things worked. He was a man who had done harm because harm had always been available to him, and who was now being required in a booth at the back of a diner that smelled like burned coffee and old pie to account for it. Nora had not moved from her position at the edge of the booth. Dutch looked at her. "You have something to say." It was not a question. Nora looked at Dex Hollis. She thought about the apartment 4 blocks east, the radiator that clunked in February, the fire escape where she drank her coffee on Sunday mornings, watching the street come alive, the specific quality of a place that is yours even when the walls belong to someone else, the particular form of safety that accumulates when you have stayed somewhere long enough to know its sounds at night and its light in the morning. "I need a written statement from your property management company," she said. "Not your word. A statement on letterhead, signed by the property manager, confirming every term Dutch described, in my hand, before Friday." Dex nodded. The nod had no pride in it. "One more thing." Nora reached into her apron pocket for the cocktail napkin she kept for quick orders and set it on the table with a pen. "Gerald Okafor. Write his name and whatever contact the non-disclosure allowed for reaching him. Trick is going to include his information in a separate communication that explains the document and names a pro bono clinic he can contact. You don't participate in that communication, but it happens." The room was very still. Dex picked up the pen and wrote. Trick had his phone out before the pen was set down. The document went to the Fresno County District Attorney's Office at 11:47 p.m., to the crime reporter at the Fresno Bee, and to an investigative journalist in Sacramento who had been covering the state attorney general's inquiry for 14 months. The Gerald Okafor addendum went separately, with a note that explained what the document was and a phone number for the clinic. Dutch stood. He did not offer his hand. Dex did not offer his. Knox came back through the door and stood without particular emphasis, his presence simply the final indication that the available options had been reduced to one. "You can leave," Dutch said. Dex Hollis left through the front door with the careful deliberateness of a man performing sobriety for a room that has stopped being impressed by his performances. He crossed the parking lot and got into the silver sedan and drove away, his taillights diminishing along the access road and turning onto the avenue and disappearing into the ordinary traffic of a Friday night in Fresno, and the shape of what had happened stayed behind in the room, which is the property of events that have actually occurred. In the diner, nobody spoke for a moment. Then the couple at the counter resumed eating. The man in the trucker's cap put down his phone. The four members near the kitchen returned to their conversation without announcement, the way people returned to conversations that had never entirely paused. Adela Cruz came through the door. She had the folded bills in one hand and her phone in the other, and the expression of someone who has watched a sequence of events unfold that she would spend considerable time rearranging in her memory before she understood what she had witnessed. She looked at Nora. Nora looked back. "Do you want some coffee?" Nora said. Adela sat at the counter. Loretta set a cup down without being asked, the way she did for people who needed something and hadn't yet found the words for it. The police arrived 22 minutes later, two officers in a white and green cruiser who came in without particular urgency and reviewed the security footage with Loretta and interviewed Adela and wrote things in a notepad and departed with the materials required to file a report. They were polite and they were professional, and they left without having resolved anything, because resolution was not the function of the institution they represented, and the resolution had already been accomplished through other means by people who operated in the spaces between institutions, in the gap where the official systems ran out and something else had to take over. Knox remained at the counter long enough for one cup of coffee. He drank it without ceremony, and when he was done, he reached into his cut and produced a coin. It was thick brass, the chapter insignia on one face, edges worn smooth from years of pocket. He set it beside his empty cup and walked out, and the door swung shut, and Nora stood looking at the coin for a moment. She picked it up. It was warm. The lot cleared by degrees. Dutch and the others went last, 12 engines starting in sequence, a low concussive rumble that traveled through the floor of the diner and up through the soles of Nora's shoes, and then the headlights swept the windows in a long arc as the formation turned for the access road and headed north. And the sound diminished by stages until it was gone, and the lot was empty except for Adela's dented Civic, and the amber of the parking lights, and the night resumed its ordinary sounds. 2 weeks passed the way weeks do when something has shifted, the routine running over the top of the change like water over new ground, wearing the shape in slowly. The letter from Hollis Property Group arrived on a Tuesday, in an envelope Nora recognized by its return address before she opened it. The language was formal and specific, and every term Dutch had stated in the diner booth was reproduced faithfully, signed by the property manager and notarized. She read it in the hallway outside her apartment, leaning against the wall, and then she went inside and placed it carefully in the folder between her birth certificate and her Social Security card. And she stood at her kitchen counter for a moment afterward, doing nothing in particular, which was its own form of statement. On the Thursday of the following week, the Fresno Bee ran a story on the second page of the local section. It described the reopening of a 2018 DUI case in connection with a broader inquiry into the relationships between Fresno County officials and a cluster of commercial developers whose legal troubles had shown a pattern of resolution that prosecutors were now prepared to call anomalous. Dex Hollis was named. Gerald Okafor's attorney from the pro bono clinic gave a brief statement that was careful and clear. The story had the quality of good investigative work, which is that it appears inevitable, as if the facts were always going to find their way to daylight and only needed someone to leave a door open. On that same Thursday, Nora worked the dinner shift. She had read the article in the morning with her coffee at the kitchen counter, her phone propped against the small copper pot she used as a sugar bowl. She had read it twice. She had not felt triumph exactly, which surprised her. What she felt was something more like the sensation of a sound she had been hearing for a long time, finally stopping. It was the background frequency of exposure that had been running under her daily life, the awareness that the ground she stood on could be shifted by a phone call from someone in an office she'd never entered. That frequency had been in her life so long she had stopped hearing it consciously. Its absence had a texture. Loretta had given her the 4 to close, which was the best shift for tips, and Nora had taken it without remark and had spent 5 hours moving between the tables with the easy competence of someone who has learned a space thoroughly. She knew the booth with the squeaky service cart wheel, the 4 top with the short leg that needed the folded napkin, the fluorescent strip above the counter that flickered on cold evenings and could be preempted by hitting the switch twice fast. These were small things. They were her things. At 9, the back booths began to fill. Dutch came in and took his usual seat and ordered coffee and apple pie, consulting the menu with his reading glasses, as he always did. And there was something in the small ritual of the glasses and the menu and the same order every time that Nora did not have a name for, but recognized as a form of steadfastness. The small repeated ceremonies that hold a life together across long stretches of weather. Knox sat at the counter. She poured his coffee without being asked. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." They did not discuss the coin, which she had moved from her apron pocket to the shelf above her kitchen sink, where she saw it every morning when she made coffee, and where it had acquired, in 2 weeks, the status of an ordinary object, which is the highest status an object can earn. The lot outside held the Harleys in their corner, chrome catching amber, engines cool and still. The night was warm, and the windows were fogged at the bottom from the heat inside. And Nora stood at the service window for a moment between orders and looked out at the familiar shape of the place, the cracked asphalt, and the lot lights and the motorcycles arranged with their particular precision, and the diner behind her full of the sounds of people eating and talking at the end of an ordinary week. It smelled the way the diner always smelled at this hour: burned coffee and warm pie crust, and the specific comfort of a space that had fed people through 23 years of commonplace and difficult evenings without ever once closing its door. It smelled like work and constancy. It smelled, to Nora Vasquez, standing in the place where she had chosen to stand on a Friday night 2 weeks ago, and every night since, like the safest floor she had ever put her feet on. She picked up the coffee pot and went back to work. The counter ran left to right, and she wiped it as she went, the clean cloth moving in long, even strokes, and in the motion she felt what she had not felt in a long time: the sensation of occupying her own life fully, from end to end, without the background frequency of precariousness that had been playing beneath everything for as long as she could remember. It was not loud, this feeling. It did not arrive with any declaration. It settled into her the way warmth does when you come inside from the cold, from the inside out, gradual and total, The particular and private knowledge of belonging somewhere, no one can make you leave. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with Nora, share it with someone who knows what it costs to hold your ground. Thank you for listening to every word.